Bloody Kansas, 3 compromises that led to conflict. Part 1. The Compromises. In the early 1800s, there were an equal number of free and slave states, but just before 1820, Missouri wanted to become a state. This would have upset the balance of free and slave state senators, so a compromise was drawn up, the Missouri Compromise. It stated that Missouri would enter as a slave state and Maine, which was carved out of Massachusetts, would enter as a new free state, keeping the balance. But the compromise also proclaimed that no state could enter the Union as a slave state north of the 36° 30' latitude. This compromise would not last long. After the Mexican-American War, the United States had gained new territories that wanted to become states. Senator Stephen Douglas pushed through Congress a new bill called the Compromise of 1850. This bill allowed California to enter as a free state, while the territories of Utah and New Mexico were granted popular sovereignty, which enabled them to vote on the question of slavery. Additionally, part of Texas became several different territories, which included some of Kansas. Southern congressmen had no interest in making territories into free states above the 36° 30' latitude. Senator Stephen Douglas played an important role in the adoption of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He strongly favored popular sovereignty and wanted to see a compromise between northern and southern senators. Senator Douglas revised this bill, stating that he was repeating what Congress had done to Utah and New Mexico in 1850. This new Kansas-Nebraska Act canceled the 1820 Missouri Compromise, allowing the people of new territories to vote on the question of slavery. In late May of 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. These congressional compromises of 1820, 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to the conflicts that occurred in the Kansas Territory, which some historians consider to be the first unofficial battles of the Civil War. The door was now open for bloody Kansas.
Part 2. The Settling of Kansas. People started to settle in Kansas. It is important to note that most did not come to decide on the question of slavery, but came to seek new lands and to raise their families. However, those who did come were deeply opposed to one another. On the one hand, the New England Immigrant Aid Society was in favor of Kansas becoming a free state.
They gave aid and Sharps rifles to free state settlers, and in October of 1854 founded the city of Lawrence, which would be a focal point for free staters. On the other hand, some southern citizens were bribed to go to Kansas in convoys. Some of these people came from Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. But the biggest pro-slavery support came from Missouri. A Missouri citizens meeting resolved to remove any and all immigrants coming to Kansas under the auspices of the Northern Immigrant Society. These conflicting sides were fanning the flames for future violence in Kansas. In 1855, the federal government called for a census in Kansas. They counted 8,500 people, and there was a call for a legislative election. This would soon be known as the bogus legislature because of the actions of the Missouri Border Ruffians. The prominent leader of the Border Ruffians was David Rice Atchison, a Missouri senator. He gave a rallying speech to a group of pro-slavery Border Ruffians, stating, "When you reside in one day's journey of the territory, when your peace, your quiet, and your property depend upon your action, you can, without an exertion, send 500 of your young men who will vote in favor of your institutions." In March of 1855, the Missourians did come to Kansas, instigated by Atchison, and forcibly replaced the ballot box judges, so that only pro-slavery votes could be cast. Very few free state votes were counted. When this was over, the Border Ruffians returned to Missouri. This action did not constitute with popular sovereignty, but was instead fraudulent voting. Part 3. The Violent Conflicts. Tensions continued to rise to the point of violence. On November 21, 1855, a pro-slavery man by the name of Franklin Coleman murdered Charles Dow over a land dispute. Coleman said it was in self-defense. Douglas County Sheriff Samuel Jones led a posse to arrest the murderer. Instead, he arrested Jacob Branson, who owned the fought-over property, and Coleman went free. Once word spread, a mob of free staters released Branson and took him back to Lawrence. Pro-slavery Jones asked Governor Wilson Shannon to send out the militia, which contained 2,000 Missourians who were bent on destroying Lawrence instead of bringing justice. The town formed its own militia and Branson left. Small skirmishes erupted in the Wakarusa Valley near Lawrence, but no large assault was made on the town. Realizing that a civil war might begin, Governor Wilson negotiated a peaceful settlement between the two sides. These events became known as the Wakarusa War. But the conflicts were far from over. 1856 saw the most violence for bloody Kansas, including the sacking of Lawrence, the Pottawatomie Massacre, the Battle of Blackjack, the Battle of Franklin, the attack on Franklin, Kansas, the destruction of Fort Saunders and Fort Titus, the Battle of Hickory Point, and the Battle of Osawatomie. Even in Congress, there were violent conflicts in response to the events in Kansas. The day before the sacking of Lawrence, Senator Charles Sumner, who was violently opposed to the Kansas Rest Act, made vindictive comments and referred to the act as the crime against Kansas. Sumner stated, "It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery." 2 days later, in retaliation to his comments, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks beat Sumner unconscious on the Senate floor with his cane. It was 3 years until Sumner could return to the Senate, but Brooks was only fined $300 for his assault. John Brown, an anti-slavery extremist, was outraged at these two events. Brown and his militia were on their way to protect Lawrence when they heard about it being sacked by 800 pro-slavery settlers led by Sheriff Jones. So in revenge, on the nights of May 24th and 25th, Brown took with him James Townsley, James Conway, and 4 of his sons to massacre pro-slavery men along the Pottawatomie Creek. He told his followers, "Better that a score of bad men should die than that one man who came here to make Kansas free state should be driven out." At 10 p.m. they attacked. At the first house, Doyle and 2 of his 3 sons were brutally killed. At the next house, Allen Wilkinson met with the same fate. Lastly, Brown's group went to the home of James Harris. They questioned the men there as to whether they were pro-slavery or involved in the attacks on Lawrence. Henry Sherman's answers were not satisfactory to Brown, so they killed him behind the house and left him in the creek. James Townsley, who lived along the Pottawatomie Creek, drove Brown's men there, but did not take part in the killings. Brown asked him to point out all the pro-slavery men in his neighborhood, but Townsley said in his account of the massacre, "I was willing to go with him to Lecompton, a pro-slavery town, and attack the leaders, or fight the enemy in the field anywhere, but I did not want to engage in killing these men." Brown's attacks went unpunished, as did much of the violence on both sides. This was just one instance of many future conflicts that would happen in bloody Kansas.
Part 4. The conflicts over the constitutions. 4 separate Kansas state constitutions were drawn up between December 1855 and October 1859. The second one was called the Lecompton Constitution and was pro-slavery. The Missouri border ruffians returned to vote for it. Free staters boycotted the election, so it passed, accepting slavery. It was now up to Congress to decide if this constitution would be adopted. Southern congressmen told President James Buchanan that they would secede if Kansas was made a free state. Buchanan supported the pro-slavery version of the Lecompton Constitution, then encouraged Northern congressmen to approve it, which they did not.
Since it failed to pass Congress, the Constitution was sent back to Kansas for a second vote. The Free Staters ended their boycott and the Constitution was rejected. By 1859, most of the pro-slavery settlers had been driven out of Kansas. When the 4th and final Constitutional Convention occurred, most of the delegates were part of the anti-slavery Republican Party. The Wyandotte Constitution passed the Kansas legislature on October 4, 1859, and was adopted by the House of Representatives on April 11, 1860. Kansas entered the Union on January 29, 1861. When President James Buchanan signed the bill approving the Wyandotte Constitution, making Kansas a free state. Over 40 years of compromise and conflict had finally been resolved, with the admission of Kansas as the 34th state.
The compromises of 1820, 1850, and especially the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act sparked the fire of violence in the Kansas Territory. But a new shadow was darkening the nation as the southern states began to leave the Union and the country prepared for the upcoming Civil War. The conflicts that had occurred in Kansas were just a sample of the violence that would erupt and tear the nation apart.